Don't be a jerks.
Okay.
Don't be a jerk sounds like a good motto for life. So we can get that emblazoned somewhere. I'm going to say a few words, not many, to introduce this, and then I will do a little interview with Vijay, and then we can throw it up into a general discussion. In his amusing 1983 survey of the U.S. class system, Paul Fussell concluded the way out of his mostly depressing taxonomy was to become an X, an outsider. Outsiders are intellectuals, bohemians, artists, self-employed hustlers, and though he doesn't say it, some independent-minded academics, or an unmoneyed aristocracy, as he put it. Later, Richard Florida would make a career out of celebrating a debased version of those Xers, non-class, not the non-class, not the generation, creatives who inhabited hipster neighborhoods. Of course, no one can exist outside the class system. That's what makes it a system. But it's a popular and for many seductive fantasy. Gramsci's idea of the intellectuals is quite different. Though they might feel independent, Fussell style, they're very much part of a class and serve a function for that class. Gramsci's conception of the intellectual isn't the one in popular usage. Well, we think of intellectuals as people who think, write, hold forth professionally, like academics or some of your more prestigious journalists. It's larger than that. It's not unlike the current conception of the professional managerial class, the social stratum, between the capitalists and the workers who direct the latter on behalf of the former. That stratum just below the upper orders was important to Italian elite theorists like Gaetano Mosca. And someday I'd like to investigate Gramsci's relationship to that school. He was clearly influenced by them, reacting to them, quotes them here and there, often disparagingly. But that stratum is crucial to running a society. Those above them derive most of their ideas about the world from them, as do many of those below. But for Mosca and his colleagues in this school, like Pareto and Mickels, these structures are eternal, transhistorical, common to any society. The revolutionary Gramsci thought it was crucial for the working class to develop its own intellectuals, who then could provide an important direction for transforming society through the institution of a party. This is not a vision of revolution as a spontaneous eruption. Sadly, though, he didn't leave us an instruction manual on how to form that class of intellectuals. Just make a couple of points from the essay. Have we copied the location of these points to the chat? These are all up there. Every social group, actually I could do that right now. Every social group coming into existence on the original terrain of an essential function in the world of production creates together with itself organically one or more strata of intellectuals, which give it homogeneity and an awareness of its own function, not only in the economic, but in the social and political fields. For capitalists, these include technicians, political economists, legal theorists, clerics, the major domos of culture. They organize people and thoughts. But for Gramsci, it's not the nature of the work that defines the intellectual so much as the context. It's not about what they do, it's how they do it and who they do it for. And echoing Gramsci's view of philosophy, all men are intellectuals, one could therefore say, but not all men have this function of society, have in society the function of intellectuals. Even the most superficially mundane of occupation requires considerable thought. Creating the new intellectual is not a matter of creating more philosophers and divines, to use Ralph Waldo Emerson's mocking phrase, but people who can develop and organize the movement towards a new society. Intellectuals are produced and elaborated through schools, which become ever more specialized. And then he makes an interesting comment, which I think might be fruitful for discussion later. This may lead to an overproduction of intellectuals in the middle strata. He says, this is not without disadvantages. It creates the possibility of vast crises of unemployment in the middle intellectual strata. Does that mean that unemployed intellectuals are a potentially revolutionary force? Will all these underemployed adjuncts be the core of a new revolutionary movement? The relationship between intellectuals and society is more complicated than that which classes have to the means of production, that is, whether you own it or work it. The stability of the social order is produced, according to Gramsci, in two dimensions. Spontaneously through the prestige of the dominant class, the hegemony we've talked about before, and coercively through the state. And intellectuals are crucial to both these aspects. He makes a distinction between urban versus rural intellectuals, or we might say now metropolitan versus non-metropolitan. The urban ones are very much identified with the general staff of production, the higher capitalist order. Rural intellectuals are linked to a mass of country people, local government officials, small-town lawyers, preachers, and are very functionally subordinate to them. Urban workers are not so politically subordinated to their intellectuals in the same way. And he talks a lot about the role of the political party. It operates in civil society in a way analogous to the state, developing leaders, political intellectuals, who direct members, or in the case of the state, the entire society towards its ends. He makes a little bitchy aside. Some intellectuals think they are the state, but the joke is on them because the bourgeoisie really is. While all members of a party aren't intellectuals in the conventional sense, the party's directive and organizational role makes them such functional intellectuals. Another discussion point I thought we could maybe talk about later. What does the debased state of political parties in the US do to this model? And he concludes this section that we read with a quick travelogue of intellectuals around the world. I think I'll leave that unremarked upon. Now, another thing he doesn't really talk very much about is how to create these organic intellectuals of the working class. There are essays on education that follow the section we read, but they're mostly about Italian educational policy, history of educational theory, this sort of thing, but very little about the task of creating intellectuals of the working class. He did emphasize in those excerpts the difficulty of study and the lack of shortcuts, or as Marx said, there is no royal road to science. In the conclusion of the excerpt in this collection on education is, if our aim is to produce a new stratum of intellectuals, including those capable of the highest degree of specialization from a social group which has not traditionally developed the appropriate attitudes, then we have unprecedented difficulties to overcome, which I think is a reminder of the importance of political education, which is what we're doing here. Vijay, any thoughts on that in general?
Well, Doug, it's great to be with you guys. I gather it's a nice day in New York City, so I'm, I suppose, really happy to see that there are some people willing to talk about communist things on a sunny day. That's brilliant. So thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. Doug, if you don't mind, I'll make some comments in general and then respond directly to what you said. The first thing is, I remember encountering Gramsci, not in the struggles I had been involved in, but in graduate school, where Gramsci had by the 1980s already been sort of decommunistized. They used to joke and say he's the communist you can take home to your family. They'd sort of ripped out the fact that he was a leader of the Communist Party, that in fact his goal was not to better understand culture, but his goal was to overthrow capitalism, to establish, a communist society. That was his goal. But when I got to graduate school, Gramsci was being used as this character in cultural studies to better understand culture. For what reason? I mean, I always asked Doug, and you remember the 1980s. You'd ask people, why are you thinking? For what reason do you think? For what reason are you trying to make a PhD or whatever? I was at the University of Chicago, and there was a table at a bar which was basically owned by Thomas Frank. He later wrote a book about. In fact, you mentioned the book about cyber culture and so on. Thomas Frank wrote a book about the invention of cool, or the politics of cool, or something like that. But I remember sitting at this table of extremely smart people, tossing around citations to each other. I used to think, for what are we doing this? Are we trying to take power and transform this wretched system, or are we just smart people around a jug of beer? And Gramsci's name used to pop up a lot. Again, it was a kind of citation culture. Foucault said this, Gramsci said this, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, I don't give a shit. I'm not a monk in a monastery, throwing out, whatever, this Pope said this and that great, here's a quote from, I don't even know who, okay? I'm not that literate in European medieval history, but you get the point. This guy said this guy said that. For what? Why? Please don't forget that Gramsci was trying to make a revolution. That was the aim. He was vindicating, the 11th thesis of Marx, in a sense, his thesis on Feuerbach. The point is to change the world, and we can come back to that. Secondly, Gramsci was not some isolated genius. I mean, he came from an amazing generation. In Peru, his generation produced Jose Carlos Mariátegui, working on the same issues. What is an intellectual? What does it mean for a Marxist to encounter your own past? Mariátegui's, essays on the Peruvian reality are all about intellectualism, ethics, and the great indigenous past of Peru. Not that far away from Gramsci's own thinking, even though they were separated by oceans, but in the same generation. On the other side, Mao, almost the same generation. I mean, born almost the same year. Gramsci, I think, is 1891. Mao is 1895. Mao also spent his entire life trying to understand what is the nature of Chinese reality. First text that we have in the collected works of Mao, 1927, report on Hunan peasantry. It's an amazing report. If you read it, one entire section is what's the role of the intellectual. He's driven by the same kind of compulsions. Ho Chi Minh, just south of Mao, same thing. Ho Chi Minh, same generation as Gramsci. We don't think like this. This is partly the Eurocentrism of the whole business. Who was Gramsci's generation? Well, let's check in France. Let's check in Germany. Let's check perhaps at most in Britain and Russia, whatever. But who cares that Ho Chi Minh is the exact same generation as Gramsci? Ho Chi Minh also very deeply invested. Why is my country, backward? Why are we not advancing? What is the role of the intellectual? What is an intellectual class? His father was a teacher in the Confucian system. Ho Chi Minh was completely interested in traditional intellectuals. Exactly the same issues. But we focus on Gramsci because he's the European, of the lot. I'm not saying don't, because my God, I've spent years trying to read him and understand what he's trying to develop and say and so on. But I do want to say that he comes from this generation of communists all around the world who are trying to understand culture, trying to understand intellectualism, and trying to understand how to make a revolution. It's not so far away. He's not like some isolated genius, There was something in the water that communists were drinking, those who were born between 1890 and 1895, that seemed to, by 30 odd years later, were in the same realm, having to grapple with the great October Revolution, the breakthrough that happened there, and why their own societies were not capable of making that breakthrough. Okay, Doug, I just wanted to say those things as a preface, because once we get to Gramsci's own thinking on intellectuals,
that's what you're here for. So go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, you see, at Tricontinental, we made a document called The New Intellectual, which I would ask you to go and take a look at, because the second part of it goes into Gramsci's idea of intellectuals. And I actually thought it would be better if you read it after we talk today, instead of reading it in before. And maybe you can ask me why later or whatever. Okay, so I have some differences with the scholarly work on Gramsci on this issue. Not because I'm seeking differences to make again, the citation business, but I actually think that there's some misreading of Gramsci. I think Gramsci has actually not just two forms of intellectuals, organic and traditional, but three: organic, traditional, and new intellectual. The new intellectual for Gramsci is the communist. And I'm going to show you very briefly, Doug, what I mean by that. I mean, the organic intellectual is pretty clear cut. And even here, there are differences, in the way people read Gramsci. It's really hard. As you said, there's no manual. I mean, Gramsci wrote these things, especially this text was put together by the Gramsci Institute. They didn't have everything in one place, they had to piece things together. Nonetheless, it's quite clear that Gramsci has at least two, if not three, definitions of intellectuals. The first is the organic intellectual. And my understanding of it is effectively what he's saying is every class has its intellectuals. You can't have a class without its intellectuals. Like, for instance, the farmers have their intellectual. They have to have somebody amongst them who's involved in the practical activity of farming, who understands the nature of soil. These are, as it were, agronomists of the people. They understand how to sow crops because they've done it. And through practice over a long period of time, they've cultivated a theory of how to grow crops. And they transmit the theory to the next generation of farmers. They are teachers in that sense. They are organic intellectuals of that community, of that class. the elites have their own intellectuals, and that's more obvious. The priests and the Machiavellis and the this and the that. But if you look at it, every class has its intellectual that's organic to the class, that emerges out of the class. And they may not get the badge of intellectualism, that's true, but that has a consequence of the culture of class, that people don't see them as intellectuals, even though how could they not be? How could they not be? Now, what happens is, as a consequence of the hierarchies of class over long periods of time, a certain section of intellectuals, the intellectuals of the elite, effectively become the traditional intellectuals. They are seen as intellectuals. So it would be priests, it would be people who are advisors of the state or bureaucrats in the state, and so on. So that class of organic intellectuals gets now a badge that they are in fact intellectuals, and they are known as traditional intellectuals. And the thing about them is that their power as traditional intellectuals allows them to act as universal intellectuals for all classes, so that then they go as priests into, say, a rural area, and rather than have the organic intellectual of that class say, listen, the reason the harvest failed was because we had a plague of locusts. And the reason there's a plague of locusts is that I know from what I've heard from our ancestors and so on, that every once in a while these bloody locusts switch direction somewhere in the desert and they come at our crops. They don't come every year. And so that's what happened. No, the priest says it's not true. The reason you had a harvest failure and the reason the locust came is you're all sinful and you're plotting to overthrow the king. And this is retribution against your sin. So there the traditional intellectual is entering into a space where there are other explanations possible for organic intellectuals, but the traditional is using their power of the badge that they've been given by the hierarchy to effectively create this other ideology. Now, that's what Gramsci says, that position, that immediate place is the contradictory consciousness, because the peasant may know that, listen, this is just a flipping, bunch of locusts. They come, they eat our things, they go. You have one reading of reality through your eyes, but you have another reading of reality from above, and that is dispersed through the traditional intellectual. I think you pretty much have gone through this, and some people disagree with points A, B, and C of this, but by and large, I think there's general agreement. But then in the middle of that text, he talks about the permanent persuader. Did you catch that phrase? I don't know what edition you're reading, but he talks about the permanent persuader. He says that there is this intellectual who is the permanent persuader, and that is who he calls the new intellectual. Now, Gramsci doesn't write in there they are the communists. I mean, there's a debate over here, because some people say, well, he was just hiding from the censor. That's why he used philosophy of praxis instead of Marxism. Others say, well, no, he was having second thoughts about some of the stuff. And maybe when he talks about these new intellectuals, you could argue along that vein, he means everybody who is trying to change the world, not just the communists. I don't care. I'm not a sectarian like that. The fact is, he talks about these permanent persuaders. And in our text, we make a lot of that, because I actually think this is a really interesting, he says, these new intellectuals are those who throw themselves into active participation in practical life as constructor, organizer, permanent persuader. That's an interesting situation. This is the person who's devoted to basically, going after the grievances of people and so on, and perhaps is trying to put forward a platform of transcendence. So, I mean, Doug, just to start as a response, I just say, I think there are in fact three different forms of intellectual: the organic, the traditional, and the new intellectual. And I think perhaps everybody in this call is trying hard to find out how to become a new intellectual.
Okay, that was great. I have a few questions before we throw it open to the masses here. Let me find this. Actually, we didn't really touch on this. We didn't read about it, and you only talked in passing about it, but I'm sort of interested in the cultural angle too. For Gramsci, culture is very important, not only for the perpetuation of bourgeois society, but for the creation of an effective opposition to it. Now, to some people, this is idealism and not real politics. What do you think about that?
Well, I'll take us back, Doug, to the preface to Marx's contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. Preface is interesting. It's read as a way to criticize Marx for his base and superstructure business. Remember that the base is the economy and production, which is a central epistemological category for Marx from perhaps the German ideology onward. Marx then believes that human history is driven by changes in production. That becomes a key thing. And so that's called the base. And then the superstructure is, culture and law and, these other things, society, social formations and so on. But Marx says something really fascinating in the preface, 1859. He says that, yes, it's true that in the moves of production, in other words, production itself, by the way, is not just technology. It's the struggle between the forces of production and the social relations of production. So you already have the activity of people inside the category of production anyway. But he says, of course, that is a very much a primary motor for the movement of history. But he says that it's in this superstructure that we have to, and here's the quote, fight it out, Marx says. You have to fight it out. I find that a great phrase. You fight it out in the superstructure. That's where politics takes place. It takes place. You fight it out over debates around law. You fight it out in debates around culture. You fight it out in debates around education and so on. Later when people said, well, Foucault was such a genius because he said you have to tackle each, perhaps vector of oppression separately. Madness has to be fought by, fighting the way psychiatry is organized and so on. I mean, there's nothing in there that it doesn't come also in the Marxist tradition. It's not some huge breakthrough because what does Marx say in the preface? He says there are all these different things that are happening and it's there that you have to fight it out. You don't have to fight only to build trade unions. You have to fight in every sphere of social life because you want to transform society, not merely to capture a union. We are not economisms. We are not in economism or whatever, what Lenin criticizes in What Is to Be Done. That's not. So culture is a central part of our worldview. We have to intervene there. That's what Marx and Engels in the German ideology call the battle of ideas, a phrase that Fidel Castro picks up after the fall of the Soviet Union and bangs on that phrase in speech after speech, talking about the importance of intervening in the battle of ideas. Why does Fidel do that? Because he says, look at the madness taking place. They actually believe that people are motivated by greed. That means the principal, starting point for all their theories is a theory of greed. Like, for instance, mainstream economics, the demand and supply curve. I want to maximize my benefit. What if I don't? What if I'm lazy? Or what if I love people and don't want to get the most out of every interaction? I mean, Doug, you have a child. Are you thinking when you deal with your child, how do I maximize my interaction with this kid? How do I get the most out of it? No, actually, you are probably, and knowing you are probably saying, I hope the kid gets 99% of the benefit of this interaction. I'll be happy with just 1%, maybe 0.5%. So most of social life, gender division of labor and all that isn't motivated by greed. It's motivated by care, by love. Nancy Folber wrote a great book, The Invisible Heart is the name of her book, which is a critique of the invisible hand theory, that the market somehow determines things by itself, blah, blah, all of that. Well, so Fidel said, no, we have to contest the core concept of our time, things like that greed is a motivator, or that the reason there's hunger in the world is there are too many people, the neo-Malthusian ideas. This is what he called the battle of ideas. Culture is a very important domain to contest, but at the same time, it is the hardest place to have a contest because some of the most ingrained ideas are in culture. Let me quickly rehearse this for you. It's not difficult, and I must say you are all in DSA, so it does seem insurmountable, but it's not difficult to win an election. I mean, Bernie Sanders was a victim of an elite conspiracy, but you have won elections here and there in the United States, even in the United States. So political, change is possible. You can win elections, you can win power in the government in other places. Economic change is also possible, not as much as one would want, but if you have some fiscal tools, some monetary tools, you can make some changes. That's possible. Social change is also possible. You can say we have legalized abortion, or you can have creches. You start changing the family. The kind of burdens of the family can be lifted. And that's social change. Cultural change is the hardest because there's the taproot of the past in your brain, ingrained. Ideas of patriarchy, ideas of racism, ideas of superiority of one kind or the other, the ideas of how things should be, the how things should be, the way in which we have always lived. These things are very difficult to contest. This idea that of greed, for instance, as a core emotion to organize human society, all of that's culture, that's the contest. That's why Gramsci is wondering, and that's why he's interested in these issues. How is it that we, the communists, lost the fight of culture to the fascists? How did the fascists gain the working class, which we had fought so hard from the early 1900s, through the Turin strikes, through the strikes all across the northern part of Italy, including down into Sardinia, peasant struggles and things like that. How did we lose the working class? We thought we had near hegemony by the 1930s. The Communist Party of Italy was growing at great bounds. Ordi Novo had historic levels of subscription of the newspaper and so on. How did we lose? And did we lose in culture? Were we not able to root ourselves in the culture of the people? That, in fact, is the core concern, in my opinion, of the prison notebook. And that is the reason why, if you read Togliatti's lectures on fascism, which he gives in Moscow, I know in the US, international publishers republished it. I wrote an introduction to that. Togliatti's concerns are not different from Gramsci. He is also wondering, how did we get whipped by the fascists in working class communities? And that's the reason the PCI, after the war, despite CIA attempting to destabilize the role of the PCI, they stole an election from the communists in Italy. The CIA went there and basically bought the Christian Democrat, and pushed them into power. Same thing they did in France. And by the way, this is not some sort of fantasy in my head. This is from the CIA's own archive, okay? But having done that, nonetheless, the PCI tried to root itself in the culture and became the largest mass communist party in Italy because they took the lessons of Gramsci and Togliatti and others seriously. How did we lose culture? And is it that culture is so deep that communists who are trying to create a future forget what the past has done to us?
All right, and one final question. I was reading Stuart Hall's essay on Gramsci, and he's mostly writing about Thatcherism, of course, in the 1980s, which is a very successful cultural intervention as well as a political intervention. But he said of Thatcherism that it addressed the fears, anxieties, the lost identities of people. It invites us to think about politics and images. It's addressed to our collective fantasies, to Britain as an imagined community, to the social imaginary. Mrs. Thatcher has totally dominated that idiom, while the left forlornly tries to drag the conversation around to our policies. Now, I'd say the bourgeoisie has nothing as popularly engaging as Thatcherism now, or Reaganism in the US version. I'd say that the critique of the left in this passage, which would apply very much to a lot of what DSA does, still seems accurate. We just don't really have that cultural response. We have policies, we have electoral strategies, that sort of thing. But what would an oppositional culture look like?
Well, firstly, I would say that I always found Stuart Hall a little too forgiving of Thatcherism. I think he gave too much to Thatcherism. It's not true what he was saying, and he didn't offer enough context. Here's what I would like to say about the context question. In general, the fact that we come from wretched cultural worlds, by and large, the United States, what is the inheritances? Slavery, Jim Crow, all of that, rooted into the culture. All of that history, which has not been, in a sense, settled, that history affords the right a cultural advantage, a major advantage. They come to the contest, in other words, already advantaged. So when Stuart writes that, Margaret Thatcher did all these things, it's not true. the right has a switch they can flick at any point, which is the switch of the past, which advantages them because the past is relatively wretched, and our past as socialists is a past of struggle, and is a past of struggle with some victories but a lot of defeats. The glorious struggles of the miners in the United States, of the textile workers, of agricultural workers in the South, black farmers who went on a major strike when Reconstruction was withdrawn. What W.E.B. Du Bois in the Black Reconstruction calls the general strike. There's a great history of struggle. But that history of struggle is not a history of, in a sense, culture. I'll give you an example. Not example, I'll give you a quotation. There's a great American poet, US poet, I think it's Muriel Rukeyser. And there was a line from a poem which I read, which really hit me hard. The line is that we are exiles from the future. I think what Rukeyser is trying to suggest is look at the difficulty it is to establish socialism or communism or whatever, something of the future. You see, you have to root yourselves in the people, right? You're a socialist. You can't roam around without acknowledging that people have their own cultural worlds. So you have to accompany the people in their struggles. At the same time, you want to build a future society that is not patriarchal, that is not racist, and so on. So what happens to people who become socialists? In a sense, they start living in tomorrow's land already. They, for instance, are quickly angered at racist remarks or patriarchal remarks, as they should be. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just proposing this is a social contradiction we face. Sometimes they live in interesting situations, bohemian kind of worlds where the word bohemian is so interesting. Bohemian kinds of worlds, they don't want to conform to the rules of the present, and so on and so forth. But then they appear alien to the class that they are trying to accompany in building this mass social force. So our relationship to culture is always complicated by this exiles from the future situation, where you are mostly in Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn has this reputation of being like a hipster borough of New York. It's not. It has its. I mean, hipsters can also be in the working class. Okay, most of you probably are from some precarious occupation or the other. I'm not making, but it's not a conventionally traditional working class neighborhood. It has its cultural differences from there. To organize the working class, the immigrant workers, precarious immigrant workers, and so on, there's a major cultural distance. And so all of this is wrapped up in the contradictions for socialists to intervene. I mean, you can't just scold socialists and say, why aren't you, flicking the switch like Margaret Thatcher did? Sorry, it's not that easy. We are trying to transform culture while we are trying to build mass struggles against the present. And that's not as easy as for the right, where they just come. That's partly the reason why the right can be led by mediocrities. You can have like a DeSantis or a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio. I mean, these are mediocre people, and I don't mean this in an elitist way. I just mean that their capacity to intellectualize for the right is zero, is literally zero. Donald Trump is not, he's not like an organic intellectual of his class even, these people just needed to be sent there to flick the switch, to talk and say, we are against Mexicans. Yay, everybody cheers, because that is an old theory. It's an old racism that goes back to God knows when, the early 1800s. Whereas socialists have to be much more careful, much more cultivating of a new garden. We have to build things, and it's much more difficult. So, Doug, I remember reading those pieces in Marxism Today, which Martin Jakes and Stuart Hall edited. That was the Communist Party magazine, where they basically said, let's wind up the Communist Party. They played that role as well in Britain. And so did Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote a book saying, let's all go back to the Labour Party. Thanks, Eric. That was great, great advice. But that's why I feel intellectuals should shy away from directly giving political advice in their work. They need to accompany movements, see what movements are capable of doing, what movements are thinking, how far movements are willing to go, and so on. You can't just sit in your house and come up with a grand theory of how to change the world. Go out there and see what movements are experiencing, what they are learning, and so on. That's really where you have to elaborate, as Gramsci says, common sense into philosophy. The new intellectual's task isn't to take Benedetto Croce and then update Croce and then let somebody else update the next word. No, the new intellectual's task is to enter the common sense of people, elaborate it into philosophy. Go back to the people, give them their common sense as philosophy, see if it's going to help them advance their struggles. That's Gramsci's basic formula for intellectual activity. It's not let's criticize the people or criticize the left because the right is doing something correctly. What doing something correctly? They're not doing anything. They just flick the switch.
Okay, thank you, Vijay. And I do want to say a word in defense of Brooklyn. It's not all hipsters, and there's a large working class here too. So don't forget about them. I'm certainly not. I wouldn't call myself terribly working class, but I'm surrounded by people who are. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my comrade and colleague Carly, who will handle the Q&A section.
Yeah. So thank you, Vijay. That was great. I took a lot of notes. So we're going to go into Q&A now. Anybody feel free to put yourself on stack. I will call on you. You can ask a question. Vijay, you will get the chance to answer, and then we will keep going. Yeah, so stack is open. I am checking the chat. Someone just got a WhatsApp message. All right, Carl, go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was a really great talk. So I had like one comment and then a question. The comment is, I always think it's important to think of this relation between base and superstructure, that to think, the role of consciousness as, very, very central to that, how we think. I mean, consciousness is, for Marx and Gramsci, in the superstructure, right? It's not, and so the superstructure is in the base is in the superstructure in that sense, in terms of consciousness. And one way to, I think a place to see this is more Marx and Gramsci, but is in the fetishism of commodities, because the fetishism is a phenomenon of consciousness, but it's in the process of economic exchange that fetishism emerges. So I think that's always important to keep in mind. It's not just structures, institutions, it's our head, what's in our head. The question I had is the section you referenced that Gramsci quotes of Marx, the base and superstructure. There's also this statement in it where Marx says, no social order is abandoned until it's basically developed what it can develop within it. Once the productive forces have reached their maximum stage of development and they can go no further. And I'm wondering how you see that fitting into both Gramsci's thinking, but also our thinking about the possibility of the transcendence of capitalism. It's kind of a big question, I know, but
yeah. How should we do this? Are we going to go one by one, or what's the plan, Kali?
Yeah, one by one.
Okay, great. Carl, that's a great question. And let me take the second part and then return to consciousness and so on. So, I belong to a communist party in India. It's the Communist Party of India, Marxist. And we consider ourselves to be in the lineage not only of Marx, but also Lenin. And I'm saying this because Lenin makes a decisive break with the 19th century Marxist tradition. In the 19th century Marxist tradition, which may have been there in Marx, and I don't want to get into a kind of Marxological debate, but it's certainly there in the Second International, in Karl Kautsky and others, that view said that one had to wait to advance the productive forces sufficiently. And then when the productive forces are sufficiently advanced, when capitalism, actually, to be more precise, is sufficiently advanced, it will run up to a contradiction against the social relations of production, private property. But here, really, again, they're talking about the proletariat, and there will be a situation of a condition of revolution, which you can either take advantage of or not. And that's there in Kautsky, that's there in Bernstein, it's there in a range of thinkers. Well, Lenin shows up and says, wait a minute, fellas, let me ask you a question. What happens in the colonies? He says, because in the colonies, colonialism deliberately prevents the advance of productive forces, deliberately. There are large tracts of the Tsarist Empire where there will never be the productive forces developed. They will always be kept at a low level, hammered down, so that the metropolitan countries can import raw materials from there, can process the raw materials into textiles, say, and ship it back out to sell. Lenin learned all the statistics from Hobson, who was a liberal writer, but wrote a very good book about this. In fact, in India, Dadabhai Nauroji in the 1870s had already written this book about the drain of wealth. So Lenin says, so what now? You can't ask people in the colonies to wait around forever, because guess what? They're never going to have productive forces well developed. So what happens? And then he argues that in the colonies, it is imperative for the communists to lead a national liberation struggle against the colonial power, and at the same time accelerate to the social revolution. So that there are situations in the world where the kind of textbook Kautskyite reading of Marx is not going to apply. You can't wait for the development of capitalism. Indeed, that's interesting. For us, that sets up a terrain called national liberation Marxism. That's why Lenin is so important to Ho Chi Minh, to Fidel and others. You know, Lenin's reading of Marx is what they, and I as well, think is the correct reading. Okay, so that means that there is an element in this national liberation Marxism, which is, you know, in a way, not sure that even Marx said that the breakthrough has to come in the most advanced capitalist countries. If you go and read, and later these texts came out, his letters to Vera Zasulich, which were collected by Theodor Scheinin. In those letters, he tells Zasulich, maybe the revolution will happen in Russia, and maybe you won't have to go through capitalism fully, but you can advance the mir into the commune. Marx was at the time very influenced by the Paris Commune. In Peru, Mariátegui says, we don't need to go through capitalism. We can look at old Incan communism, which still exists in the countryside, and we can bring it into a advanced modern social form. So these are very creative people trying to be creative about, in a sense, this issue of the advancement of productive forces. You know, can it be accelerated by socialists when imperialism is just not going to allow it to happen? So very interesting development. That's the reason, in a way, why Gramsci writes his essay, The Revolution Against Capital. He means Marx's book, Das Kapital, when he writes about the revolution, October Revolution. That essay is interesting because Gramsci says, look, they didn't advance. It was a backward country. And yet they made the first proletarian revolution. Where's Germany? You know, where's Britain? They don't do it. And Lenin, in his text Imperialism, argues that they don't do it because the working class has been, in a sense, incorporated into the structure. In one section of the working class becomes the labor aristocracy, the aristocracy of labor, and so on. So that's the critique of, in a sense, or debate inside Marxism, I think. One debate, which is, I find a very productive debate. It begs the question, why is it that all revolutions of a socialist kind have happened in poor countries? You know, in the Tsarist Empire, in the old, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, you know, where is the revolution in the advanced industrial states? Didn't happen. Why? That's a question that Gramsci raises, I think, in a very bad way when he talks about the East and the West. That section of his prison notebooks has been made a lot of by Perry Anderson when he writes about the antinomies of Antonio Gramsci. I think that's a very bad formulation. Gramsci too much dualizes between what happened in Russia and then the rest of Europe. He doesn't see the rest of the world. Gramsci doesn't see Africa, Asia, Latin America. He can't grasp colonialism. He doesn't understand it. He has no experience. So even when he writes about the North and the South, it's extraordinarily blind. He just doesn't know that stuff. And it's fascinating because Lenin knew it already. Lenin published Imperialism in 1916. Gramsci is writing after that. And yet he hasn't grasped the centrality of imperialism. It just doesn't occur to him in the vast oeuvre of the prison notebook. Doesn't come. Question of consciousness is interesting. In my opinion, in the base, as you rightly said, consciousness is operating because, firstly, nothing human can be without a conscious understanding of it. And when Marx says that in the base, it is the productive forces that clash against the social relations of production, the social relations of production are the instantiation of consciousness and conscious history. So is the productive forces. I mean, for God's sake, some scientist has to come up with a better way to do things. Consciousness also exists there. But he says that we can measure the developments in the base with the precision of natural science. Remember, that's the phrase in the preface, with the precision of natural science. But in the superstructure, you fight it out. If you look at computers, for a history of computers, you can see a little of this. You can track pretty precisely the development of computerization and why certain problems were solved in certain ways and so on. Not always correctly, but solved in certain ways. You can track with the precision of natural science the development, say, of growth rates and so on. But it's much harder to track the class struggle. In that sense, the class struggle or the conscious class struggle is much more in the realm of interpretation and much more in the realm of the political fight, the battle of ideas and so on. So even in the base, you of course have consciousness. It's not just that it's something that happens outside history, which was the attack on base and superstructure made even by Marxists like Raymond Williams. I think his essay on base and superstructure is a very poor essay because he's fighting a straw man. That essay was published in New Left Review, very long essay. I'm not impressed by it. I think it's a straw man that he's fighting against. There are real problems here, but that's not one of them.
Awesome, thank you. Ben.
Well, maybe that relates a little bit to what I wanted to ask. First of all, I just want to say, I thought what you said, Vijay, about the three kinds of intellectual is really useful. And just to highlight, that really is a useful filter for me for this text, the traditional organic and then the new intellectual, trying to move beyond that polarity. But in terms of this question of cultural struggle, my question is, so there's this distinction between the traditional intellectuals defined by their use for a ruling class and the traditional categories of intellectual, and then organic intellectuals, by which I take it he's trying to say, every class produces intellectuals, they're intellectuals on the shop floor, in the store, people who know how to get things done, how to mobilize their comrades, that you wouldn't define through the way we think about, the intellectual respect and prestige and so on. But I guess when we talk about cultural struggle now, I guess what I see is that basically most of the lefties are actually focused in the traditional terrain of intellectuals, like academics and cultural producers, essentially, of one form or another. Now there's a left-wing consciousness among them, but I think that kind of comes because those spheres are dominated by liberal ideological formations and emerge from the contradictions of capitalist liberals. But it affects the way people talk about cultural struggle means, because the first impulse within any crisis is to do things within these traditional spheres. There's a social crisis, produce a syllabus, the Black Lives Matter syllabus, or the financial crisis syllabus, or let's do an art show, or within the traditional forms of intellectual prestige. And to me, I see that as a real contradiction of the present, is trying to break out of that while still preserving the insights, but the need to fight it out, as you said, that you can't leave these spaces, but also that they also exist as a form of incorporation. And, very concretely in terms of who's on this call, what we're trying to work with, those are the troops we're going to war with. And the situation we're trying to break out with. So do you have comments on that or how to think about those problems?
No, look, what you said is absolutely correct. I completely agree with your assessment. I mean, look at Doug Henwood over here. Doug, what year did you create Left Business Observer?
That was 1986.
So in 1986, he could have probably, I don't know anything about your history, Doug, so I'm making it up. Doug could probably have gone into some economics department somewhere or the other. He could have taught how Wall Street functions, seminar number 1, seminar number 2.
I'm actually a dropout from an English PhD program.
Whatever it is, you wrote a good book on Wall Street, but you may have been able to parlay that, whatever. Instead, he produced a kind of, I just found that note you made about Victor Navatsky interesting. He produced a thing to circulate among people, Left Business Observer, to give them, many people, even in the broader left, had no clue how Wall Street functions, what is derivative, what is a collateral debt obligation, and so then he writes a book and whatever. I mean, the point is that imagine if Doug, and I'm going to say things I don't know anything about, okay? Imagine if this man, Doug Henwood, was in 1986, rooted at the time in a vibrant DSA in 1986. And if he was able then to be used by his party to send around the United States to talk to trade unions, to inform, do political education in the union movement. Let's say SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, had him go and talk about the futility of financing the Democratic Party, of the importance of building their phalanx, and so on and so forth. Had debates with working class union, leaders and so on. Imagine if there was an opening at the time. Imagine then if the SEIU would have persisted in the 90s to be the backer of Bill Clinton, instead had used their strength, their considerable muscle, HERE, SEIU, all these unions, to go out there and build in their communities, deepen themselves into those who are becoming at the time precarious workers, fight against deindustrialization, fight against the kind of concessionary bargaining and so on. Imagine if there had been a political instrument then, how it could have used intellectuals. Because after all, the point of intellectual activity, in my opinion, Ben, of the left, is not to come up with good arguments. The point of intellectual activity and of the intellectual is to be used by the movements. And there's a way in which liberal intellectuals attack that, saying, oh, you are merely an instrument of a movement. Yes, exactly. That's exactly correct. The exact thing that you are criticizing me, you have no independence, is exactly what I think is the role of the new intellectual. The role of the new intellectual is not to be an independent person standing aloof, sitting on a mountain pronouncing judgment at the world. The point of the new intellectual is to throw yourself and accompany movements to provide the great learning that civilization has been able to accumulate, be the bridge between the library and the movement. You're not there merely to be like, propagandist. You're there to provide, in a sense, the sharp edge of political education and learn yourself. I do a lot of political education. When I'm teaching a peasant organizations classes or classes of a trade union somewhere, I learn as much as I'm teaching, frankly. I come away with an enormous amount of learning. I was teaching recently in a peasant school in Argentina. I mean, I learned a lot from them, about migrant labor, about the nature of agriculture, about the difficulty they're having with the soil, because they are organic intellectuals of their class. That's what propelled them into being leaders of the peasant struggle. And that's what brought them into interaction with me, who was bringing my reading of world history and so on, which I was able to get because I had access to a PhD, to libraries, to learn how to read and so on. Our interaction had to be an interaction of mutual growth. I was quite confident there were lots of things I knew more than them. And I was confident that they knew things more than me. The worst thing about new intellectualism is to enter those spaces and patronize people. say, oh, you know everything, I don't know, I just have a PhD, I don't know anything. That's bloody bullshit. You have a PhD, you read a lot, you've learned how to think inside, you got to share all that. You've got to use your considerable expertise. No need to be falsely modest about that. That shouldn't make you arrogant, because other organic intellectuals bring other things to the table you don't know anything about. So, when you say that, Ben, it really touches a nerve for me, because I feel deeply that what you say is correct. But I don't blame anybody in places like the United States, because you simply don't have the kind of movements that you can accompany. But that doesn't mean that you mustn't go out there and accompany some movements, make the attempt. The only way to build a movement is to be a part of it. You can't build a movement by writing a book about how to build the movement.
Thank you. Carrington.
Thank you, Vijay, so much for your comments. I feel like almost saturated. I almost don't have any questions. I'm still processing everything. But one thing you said is that of all the types of change, cultural change is the hardest. And I'm guessing you're saying that that's the job of the sort of new intellectual and what you were just describing. But we are doing political education, and we're trying to educate like ourselves, right? We're reading Gramsci, we're reading Lenin, we're bringing in, speakers with different perspectives. Happy to have you. But I wonder if we can go through a training, like I think Marx says, like, who will educate the educators? And I just wonder, as a political educator, do you have tips for us? Is that something you would give us, on the side or whatever? I mean, I know you're giving tips right now that we should embed ourselves with already existing movements, but really, like, in terms of how to do political ed, where you're not, proselytizing, you're not condescending, patronizing, but you are like sharing the information you have. I wonder if you have like any pointers or direction you could recommend for DSA.
Actually, Carrington, I can't, because I don't know the context sufficiently well. These are things that emerge out of a conjuncture, out of a context, out of the experiences all of you have. I mean, I would just say you have to keep looking for them. As is quite clear, I don't even know much about Brooklyn, frankly. When I come to New York City, I'm generally within a few blocks of the People's Forum, and then I depart. If anything, I take the train to New Jersey, to the Indian part of New Jersey to meet some friends or go see a Hindi movie or whatever. But I really don't know the context that well. And so it would be strange for me to fantasize, what should you do? But I would say you got to be creative in looking for opportunities. I mean, it's just not possible if what Doug says is correct. If there are lots of working class communities and maybe lots of immigrant communities, it's so important just to get involved in their lives, to see what's happening there. I don't have any direct thing, but all I would say is, you guys, among you, from the people I know here, are extraordinarily gifted and bright people. And I'm sure that there's a lot that people would appreciate learning from you as well. I can't answer it directly. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Eric.
Oh, I'll pass, thanks.
In that case, stack is open. Carl.
Oh, I just want to, Vijay, I think that was actually a very good answer to exactly that question. I mean, it's not like there's, a series of, bullet points that we can sort of take away. I mean, I think, what Gramsci is at his best trying to teach us is this is a process of embedding theory, embedding thought inside a practice. And, I think you're exactly right that it's about trying to find those points of, where we can intercede or, locate ourselves. And, the US context is very difficult because so many of the movements I would say they have kind of a corporatist quality to them. You know, the leaders broker on behalf of like this imputed community of interest. And then, so it's very hard. The politics here is very much about, you know, recognition and sort of, you know, kind of mutual recognition and, you know, giving certain people their space to self-define. And it's not like that's bad per se, but it's very hard to move beyond that, has been my experience in the US political context. So it's just like an issue we're always encountering.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to invite Vijay to Brooklyn if you want to come investigate. We invite you. I know Doug's a renowned chef. Maybe he'll make you dinner and we can give you a tour and you can check that off your list.
Stack is otherwise open. Eric, is that you getting on Stack again?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really have my intervention that thought out, but since it's open, I mean, I had some questions about on the characterization of the Italian CP as taking Gramsci seriously, right? It does seem to me like the same distortions of Gramsci, but them were made in Marxism today and in a lot of academia. And when Gramsci says, when the party is progressive, it functions democratically. When the democratic centralism, when the party is regressive, it functions bureaucratically. And his disagreements with Bordiga, I mean, I don't think he, you know, his ideas came out on top there. And then in the ideas of we were talking about the organic intellectuals and the permanent persuader, and I do think it was somewhat the passages in the prison notebooks were somewhat in code, right? So he couldn't talk so much about class and revolution, but he says very similar things elsewhere when we're reading about the factory commissions in Turin. The workers loved L'Ordine Nuovo because in it they found something of themselves, the best part of themselves, because in it they sense their own inner striving. You know, how best can we be free, right? And it was the paper was used to take the voices of those workers and amplify them, and, you know, develop a class intellectual, not people coming from outside. And that you know, it was in those workers' councils. I think Gramsci was right, actually, to, you know, to reject the idea of aristocracy of labor and look instead at the kind of intellectuals in the parties and unions that were coming from outside the class as what held them back. So when you say, when Vijay says revolution did not happen in other parts of the West after the Russian October Revolution, but did happen in the ex-colonial countries, yes, revolutions happened, but you also had national liberation without socialism there. Those weren't always what, you know, certainly weren't Gramsci was talking about as revolution. Just to end with Gramsci writing in 1920, you know, the revolution is not necessarily proletarian and communist if it proposes and obtains the overthrow of the bourgeois state, or, you know, is not proletarian and communist even if the wave of popular insurrection places power in the hands of men who call themselves communists, even if they seriously believe that. It's proletarian and communist only insofar as it liberates proletarian and communist forces of production, forces that have been developed into society, blah, 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 insofar as it advances and promotes the growth of proletarian and communist forces that begin the patient methodical work necessary for the construction of a new order in relations of production and distribution, and, you know, based in the workers' councils, et cetera. And I don't think that didn't happen in a lot of those places where revolutions happened elsewhere. So I think there's you know, it's still useful in both those. What he's talking about is something useful in both those places. Just throw that out there, because I don't think that you know, Gramsci was missing a certain amount of internationalism in you know, how he was concentrated on what was happening right in front of them and then in jail and isolated from all that. But I don't think we can, use bringing in internationalism as a way of bringing in the kind of the Stalinist idea of Marx that I think Gramsci was actually fighting against.
It was difficult for me to hear because it was coming in and out. But I don't know if there was a question.
I think Doug's on stack, and maybe Eric, if his connection comes back in.
Okay. I know you don't think much of, I learned that you don't think much of Hall's analysis of Gramsci or his angle on Thatcherism, but he did make something out of the crisis of authority, which is what Thatcher addressed. And I think that neoliberalism, at least in its early phases, did achieve some degree of popular assent or credibility. And now that's all dead. And it seems to me that neoliberalism has lost whatever authority it ever had, that capitalism is in widespread disrepute. And there does seem to be a generalized crisis of authority, which is something that Gramsci made a big deal out of. What do you think of the political possibilities of that crisis of authority at the moment?
It just sort of went in and out. What do I think of the crisis of authority now? Right? My internet was screwing up at the end.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Let me try that again. I think I know you're not fond of analysis of Hall's interpretation of Thatcherism, but his argument that she was and Reagan here were addressing a crisis of authority. They did achieve some degree of popular assent for neoliberalism. Capitalism had prestige for a couple of decades. That's all shot. And we seem to be in the midst of another crisis of authority, maybe even more extensive, because people really, there's an awful lot of alienation from capitalism, which is great at any time in my lifetime, or maybe since I was very young. So what do you make of that? What are the political possibilities of that? How can we work with that?
Well, I think in the last 100 years, we've learned that that, let's say, an economic crisis or even a political crisis doesn't necessarily advantage the forces of progress, not necessarily. I mean, it really depends what the strength of the left is. And if the left has been able to build its own independent, role in the crisis, if it has been able to, if it comes to the crisis with a certain developed and organized force. I'm not one to disparage spontaneity and the importance of spontaneity, but I covered the uprisings in Egypt. I was there in Tahrir Square, and I can tell you the big absence in that struggle was an organized force of the left. There was an organized force of the right, the Muslim Brotherhood, which entirely took advantage of spontaneity for its own ends. And Mohammed Morsi's ascent in 2012 is entirely premised on the fact that the left was absent because it didn't exist. It had been destroyed. There were lots of, laptopy liberals trying to, insert themselves, but they didn't have a mass base. They didn't have an organized force. So, I mean, I might be a slight outlier. I don't know what your opinion is on organizing a left force that is a spear that can enter a crisis and essentially, strong arm or muscle out the right in order to put its own views forward. But if absent that strength of the left, the right, in the case of the advanced countries, the far right is able to take great advantage of the situation. I mean, Trump was not an outlier in that sense. And look at the very great, if I can speak in Stuart Hall's voice, the brilliance of Trump to step into that terrain and say that, hey, listen, I'm with you guys. When Trump comes there, steps out of the room and says that, listen, I know those people inside that room, they steal from you. They don't pay taxes. I know that because I'm one of them. And, I can tell you that they are thieves and crooks and the elite are shit. And then Trump goes right back in there, does the same thing as them, and then opens a window and yells out, blame the Mexicans, and then shuts the window. And his, theory of the crisis catches fire. And people are like, Trump is great because he says the truth. What's the truth? They're crooks in there. I know because I'm one of them. That's truth number one. And truth number two is blame the Mexicans. But no structural critique, no sense of, that, well, those people in there, how are we going to deal with them? How are we going to deal? I am going to deal with them. I, Trump, am your savior. It was a kind of, remember that book published by South End Press called Friendly Fascism, where the writer, I think, quite cleverly said, if fascism comes to the United States, it'll be friendly. It won't come in jackboots and uniforms. I was like, when I looked at that book at that time, I was like, sorry, man, fascism already came to the US in white hoods and they burnt people on crosses and they were pretty ferocious bunch of fascists, But anyway, the point is well taken. There's Trump saying, I'm your Führer. And I covered a couple of Trump rallies in the first election when he defeated Hillary Clinton. I went to one rally in Western Pennsylvania. My God, it was incredible. His entire speech was, the elite are crooks, and people were going crazy. And then he would say, there are people who live in this country who take but don't give. And then Mexicans. That was the three parts. Part one, the elite are crooks. Part two, there are people who take and don't give, by which he means blacks, Latinos maybe. But he didn't name anything. He just said there are people who take, and that sounded to me like Reagan's welfare queen. Remember, flick the switch. And then pivot and Mexicans. We're going to build a wall. People went nuts. So in that sense, Doug, when there's a crisis of legitimacy, there is an enduring crisis of legitimacy, but the neo-fascist elements are able to flick these old switches, and they are powerful enough, and they have money power behind them, if not organized forces, to basically take advantage of the conjuncture. But if the left is weak, look, Bernie Sanders was at the same time providing an opportunity for the left of center, right? At the same time. Was it a tactical error to try to take on not only the conjuncture, but also the Democratic National Committee, which basically sabotaged his advance as far as I know? Imagine if Sanders and Trump went head to head that year, if they were the candidates, would the conjuncture have been utilized by the left in a creative way to construct a new form of political legitimacy? Not at all, because the left was weak. It relied on Bernie. There may have been a slight move away from the harshness of the structure, but you got to build the left. The left has to be strong enough. And the part I heard of what Eric was saying, about substitutionism, that's the general term, that the party shouldn't substitute for the class and so on. I know all those debates, but I'm not that keen on them. They're all great debates, but they are historical. The debate now is, are we trying to say that we're just sitting around waiting for the working class to rise up? If that's the attitude, and you also have a Gramscian understanding about how culture obliterates people's confidence and capacity to act, you'll be waiting forever. So I don't have any problem with various classes joining together to form a political organization, as long as they root themselves in working class struggles and don't try to substitute themselves for those struggles. That's always a challenge. There's no formula here. It's always a challenge to maintain the integrity of, I've often found these debates interesting in the past debates, and they often go around in a guise of anti-Stalinism. I find these interesting because they often come from sections, and I wonder what they would have done had they prevailed. Would they have done things radically differently? After all, I mean, I heard that bit when Eric was saying that Gramsci's oeuvre is a critique of Stalinism. I think that's an interpretation of Gramsci as well. Gramsci never says that. So that is being interpreted, because how can Gramsci not say that? Because when Gramsci was writing all that stuff, the idea that Stalin was doing X, Y, Z was not clear to the Italians, certainly not in prison. He was reflecting on Italy. He was not having a debate in the international communist movement. So that's a interpretation, people retroactively reading into the prison notebooks that it's a critique of Stalinism. I actually don't think it is. I think he's dealing with a particular Italian conjuncture, which he finds that he himself also, not just, Bodiga and, others, it's also he was honest enough to understand that even he had not read the conjuncture properly. That maybe after Turin, other things should have been done, after the Turin strikes and so on. So in that sense, I feel like absent a strong political form of the left, whatever that form might be, the crisis of authority can be taken advantage of by anybody. In fact, even neoliberals could have asserted themselves again, and they did in many countries. In many countries, they sort of look at the IMF, which is able to repackage itself every 2 or 3 years. Every 2 or 3 years, 2016, they wrote a critique of neoliberalism. IMF published a critique in their journal of neoliberalism. Okay, during Black Lives Matter, the IMF did a critique of racism in IMF policy. Yeah. Think about that. They are able to keep asserting themselves into the battle of ideas, to reinvent themselves. An interesting thing about the left in disjuncture from that is, rather than continually renewing and revitalizing for tomorrow, we end up fighting yesterday's battles. We end up having debates about 1920s, 30s, 40s, and increasingly make ourselves irrelevant to the leading questions of our own conjuncture. And I have a problem with that, frankly, because I'm more interested in how to advance the conjuncture than to become a more accurate historian of the past.
Thank you. Julian, you're up. Julian, if you'd like to ask a question, you can go now. Okay, otherwise we can go to Ben, and then Julian, if you'd like to go after, please just let me know.
Sort of, you got into what I wanted to ask, and I mean, I guess, I think this technically the title of this session is Gramsci Internationalism or some such. Well, I mean, I know Gramsci's ideas, well, particularly in Stuart Hall, been used to talk about, try and think about the relationship between race and caste or identity and class struggle. And I know there are these readings of, Gramsci talking about the North and the South of Italy as being a kind of a tool by proxy to think about some of the relationships of colonial struggle to anti-capitalist struggle. And I know that's had a certain kind of importance in India in ways that I don't really understand at all. So I just wonder what you think of those readings, and if you could comment on them, because I think that's some people have had like you were saying, the certain kind of exposure to Gramsci. Those are the frameworks they'll approach them through. And also, I really am interested in broadening my understanding of how these ideas have been useful or used ideologically in other contexts. So there you go.
Kali, if Julian can go now, because I would like to leave in a little bit. I can't stay too much longer, but I can take both questions together. And Ben's is so good to wrap things up with that Julian's better be really good too. So there it is.
All right, Julian, you're on the spot.
No pressure.
Mine might be a little simpler than that. Am I good? You hear me? Yes. Okay. Vijay, if I can quickly get your perspective, and if possible, a Gramscian perspective in your theory and and a exercise of, not as a substitution, the effectiveness of, for the younger generations now. And like you say, the more organic people built through struggle, and or the people using social media in the media battle or the information battle as you described it. Do you find it effective as you see it or not, or how Gramsci would see it? Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess Julian's question should come first. I don't know, Julian. You know, if our purpose, there is a dual purpose in the battle of ideas. One is, the purpose is to contest the narratives of the elite, you know, to contest it frontally. I think that's one front or one trench in the battle of ideas. The other trench is to build the strength, the confidence, clarity, and so on of the class, of the key classes of our movement. You know, as you understand them differently in your different national and regional contexts. You know, in India, for instance, it would be the working class, peasantry, precarious workers, women workers who work in the care industry are very key in the struggles now, and so on. You know, sections of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia. Those are the key classes where you want to strengthen the confidence, the clarity, you know, the capacity, and so on. So those are the two trenches in the battle of ideas. Now, in the second trench, in the trench of the working class, peasantry, and so on, social media of a different kind plays a role. And in different countries, it's different. Like in India, for instance, it's WhatsApp is a big place. WhatsApp messages travel at lightning speed and shape opinion. Very hard to contest that because it's closed groups, WhatsApp groups. People don't use Facebook, Twitter, all that much in as large numbers in those classes in that part of the world. So this is an assessment. You know, if you're talking about the United States, I don't know what the platform of the moment is. Is it TikTok? Is it something other than that? You know, yesterday I went on a show, a Canadian. It was on Twitch. And it's the second time I've been on his Twitch platform. I found that fascinating. You know, people with all kinds of odd questions that they ask, extraterrestrial feeling I got, you know, there. It was like being in another planet. I mean, I felt my age a lot. You know, it's like when you wake up on a cold morning and you feel your joints go, oh God, I wish I longed to have been 20 years old again. I got onto this platform and I was like, wow, I wish I was starting my life now and I could enjoy the kind of strange feeling of democracy on this platform where people just come in and say whatever the hell they want while you're talking. And it all shows on the screen. You know, I found that liberating in a way. People criticizing you as you talk, you know, and not sure whether they are bots or whatever the hell they are. Very interesting. So Julian, I don't know. I really don't know. I can't answer your question. But I think you should think hard about it, about the role of social media in the battle of ideas. I think you need to think hard because you know that sphere better than I do. So think hard about it. You know, come up with an idea. Maybe this branch of the DSA can pioneer, you know, a draft text on socialists and social media and for discussion and debate. Could be interesting. Anyway, Ben, here's the thing. You know, I'm not interested, as I said earlier, in the kind of scholasticism regarding, you know, people like Gramsci and so on. I'm interested in what we can learn from them. You know, if you think of our movements as a kind of knife that wants to cut through the rock of the present, study is like the sharpening of your knife. And thinkers like Gramsci are like the rock against which we sharpen our knives. I don't go to Gramsci to learn what to do today. I don't go to Marx to learn what to do today. I don't teach Marx every year to people as a religion. We read Marx to understand the structures of capitalism today. You know, is the method useful for us? Are there insights that we can use in our world today? study is, as scientists have learned, they don't, when you go to a biology class or a biochemistry class, they don't teach science in order for you to learn science. They teach science in the gap between the science and social problems or corporate problems, depending on the structure in which the science is taught. Can we solve some problems of corporations, or can we solve some social problems, and so on. You have to approach, in my opinion, the great classics of our tradition, not to only learn what they are all about, or not to have a discussion about what did Gramsci say about this, or what can I derive from there, and then apply to the world. The question is always, for Marxists, is the question of translation. How do I get insights, and what does the method enable me to do in my assessment of the present and the dynamic of social struggles? Leftist people should never populate their texts with proof from the past, XYZ, because Marx said it. Marx can be wrong in a lot of things he says. Engels was wrong, deeply wrong, in his initial assessment of French colonization of Algeria in 1830. Engels' first writing was that it's a good thing. Go out there and colonize the Algerians. But when he wrote in the 1850s, late 50s, so about almost 20 years later, he wrote an encyclopedia entry for American Cyclomaid, or whatever it's called. He wrote an entry called Algeria. You can see it in his in the collected works. He attacks the French and he stands with the Algerians because he was wrong earlier, So the problem with going back into treating the tradition like a religion is that you end up, again, trying to find answers in the past. My God, that's a religious attitude towards Marxism, towards the tradition of socialist writing. Please don't cultivate a religious attitude to Gramsci. Don't treat Gramsci's text like a finished document where Gramsci has prophetically seen everything. He has not. Gramsci doesn't know a lot of stuff. So this north-south stuff, it's actually about the north and south of Italy. It was weird how Edward Said took that out of there and used it to talk about colonialism. Because it's not about colonialism. It's about uneven development inside a country. It's a little bit about the rural-urban divide. A little bit, but it's not, the Southern question is not about colonialism. And I think it's irresponsible to take that and to make it about colonialism. Italy at the time had its colonial adventures in Libya, in Ethiopia, and so on, mainly at the time in Libya. First aerial bombardment in the world was conducted by the Italian Air Force in Libya. That's the first aerial bombardment in the world. Gramsci is not talking about Libya. When he does talk about Africa, it's actually painful to read. I don't know if you guys read the section on Africa. It is painful. It is painful because he has not transcended European racism. It's there, Let's face facts. I mean, you don't have to protect Gramsci from reality. When Marxists of that generation write about gender, it's painful to read the texts, because they have not transcended themselves from 19th century patriarchy. They are inheritors of it. They're all born in the 1890s, That's why it was so extraordinary when Mao goes to Beijing in 1949 and say, women hold up half the sky. He made a decisive break with patriarchy. They banned foot binding. That was a decisive break with patriarchy. That's amazing. I mean, in fact, Engels is a great example of this. Engels, in most of his writings, sometimes pretty offensive about women, except in The Origin of the Family, where he writes with great feeling about the social construction of patriarchy. So I would say, the way to approach Gramsci is somebody in our tradition from whom we can learn a lot, but to whom we must not go for evidence about things we think. Because we have to think for ourselves. I don't understand why even the Marxist tradition often descends into a tradition of citations. We should be a tradition of advancing struggles and of thinking about how struggles operate in the conjuncture, and not a tradition of citation. So guys, approach Gramsci in the following way. If you don't like the book, throw it away. If you find it useful to think with, read it. But don't treat it like a religious text. And now, Carrington, Doug, I will have to leave you. Because
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. That was fabulous.
yeah. Thanks a lot, guys. Good luck with the rest of your studies. See you later. Bye.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
And thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you, Doug, for hosting the conversation, and Carly for moderating. We have a few announcements if people want to stick around just for a second. Let me grab them. Okay, so this concludes Gramsci January, North Brooklyn Political Ed. We hope everyone had a good experience and learned a lot. Next up would be political education wise is New York City DSA citywide night school, where this spring we hope to host a series on the US's rich socialist tradition. So from Du Bois to Debs, the Black Panthers to Bernie Sanders, the labor and anti-war movement, and Communist Party, McCarthyism, COINTELPRO. We're still working on the syllabus, but it should be interesting. If you'd like to sign up for the mailing list or share it with anyone, here it is. You can sign up. Fine, let's see. Oh, feedback form. If you have any comments, recommendations, suggestions for like how we could have done things better, what worked, what you'd like to see in the future. Do we want to do, you know, Ho Chi Minh January in 2024? I kind of doubt it's the presidential year, but you know, are there other things you'd like to see us study? We'd love to hear that from you. Finally, let's see, Bushwick is hosting or is holding Saturday and Sunday Tax the Rich canvases. You can find out more and sign up and just find other information at the New York City DSA calendar. And I'm sharing all the links if people aren't catching that. And then let's see, one of the last things is, the second to last thing, Central Brooklyn will be hosting something called Study Hall, which will be the study of Stuart Hall. Despite Vijay's criticism, I think a lot of people do enjoy studying him, and it will be Saturday nights at 7:30 starting in February. I think they hope to go for 6 sessions. Here's the link. And finally, we are North Brooklyn Political Ed. If you'd like to get involved with us or with citywide political ed, we'd love to have you. We are currently in need of people who are savvy about administrative work, such as Action Network, you know, organizing meetings, agendas, scheduling, that type of thing. We're a little short on that. We're long on creative, wonderful ideas, but we'd love to have any your participation if you'd like to join us. So feel free to get in touch. I guess that is it. I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Well,